Sir, I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what you think you're doing out here. Walter didn't look up. The line ran through his fingers, slow, deliberate, and he let maybe 4 seconds pass before he answered. Redfish run best before the herons wake. The compliance officer's John boat had puttered up from the South Channel, spotlights still burning white against the cordgrass even though the sky had gone gray enough to read by. The man in the bow held a clipboard like a shield and wore the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was already discovering it wasn't going the way he'd planned. Walter fed another inch of line into the current. The water was black and slow, moving the way deep water moves when it has somewhere important to be. The pluff mud smell was thick. In the cordgrass, a yellowlegs called once and went quiet. The herons hadn't woken yet. He had killed the motor 200 yards back, not because of the fish, though that's what he would have said if anyone had been there to ask. The truth was older than that. The truth was that when the engine went quiet and he shipped the oars, and the aluminum hull began to move on its own momentum through the dark water, the marsh sounded like itself again, like the real version of itself, the one underneath. He pulled with long, even strokes, not hurrying. The oars made almost nothing. A small whisper of entry, a pull, a feather out, and the John boat tracked through the cordgrass corridor, as steady as a compass needle. His shoulders had done this 10,000 mornings, maybe more. The sky was the color of old iron, not light yet, but the dark had stopped being absolute. Stars still sharp overhead, but the eastern tree line had gone soft at its edge. He noted it without looking at it directly. The way he noted things. He watched the cordgrass banks the way a man watches something he trusts but has learned not to fully trust. Steady, even, his eyes moving in small practiced arcs from bank to water to the bend ahead, down to the waterline angle of the grass where the tide had peaked and begun to slack, then back. It was not suspicious, it was just how he saw. The way a dog points without deciding to point. At the stern thwart, wedged between the tackle box and the port gunwale, sat the chart case. Old canvas coated in rubberized black, cracked at its spine, the brass zipper green with oxidation. He had set it there before he left the truck. Same as every morning. When he loaded the oars, he put one hand on it once, just a flat palm, just for a second, and then loaded the rest of his gear and got in the boat. He did not open it. He never opened it out here. He was not sure he could say why, only that it belonged in the John boat the way an old letter belongs in a coat pocket. Not to be read, just to be carried. Present, that was the word. It needed to be present. The pocket opened up on his left around the last bend. A private crook in the estuary where the cordgrass pulled back, and the bottom went from clay to shell and the water held depth even at low tide. No road reached it. You could not see it from the channel. He had found it by moving through it in the dark 37 years before he ever brought a fishing rod out here, and he had never told anyone exactly where it was. He let the John boat coast the last 20 feet. The anchor was a 10-pound Navy mushroom, gray and worn smooth. He lifted it off the bow with both hands and set it into the water, slow, no splash. He let the chain run through his fingers link by link, controlling it the whole way down, and when it touched bottom, he cleated the bowline off with 2 wraps and a half hitch that his fingers finished before his eyes had even looked down. To confirm, the boat settled, stopped. He sat. The marsh was alive in the way it's only alive before first light, when the night things haven't quit and the day things haven't started, and the water sits between 2 different versions of itself. A mullet jumped somewhere out in the dark and landed flat. The yellowlegs called again from a different spot. The pluff mud breathed out its low, old smell. Walter picked up his rod, let the line out into the current. His eyes were already moving again, cordgrass edge, waterline, the bend behind him, the bend ahead, slow and steady, reading the marsh the way a man reads his own handwriting. Unhurried, awake, completely. The herons still hadn't woken. The line went out clean. No snap, no wobble, just a long arc into the black water and then the small sound of entry. Barely a ring on the surface, gone before you could name it. Walter settled the rod butt against his thigh and let his hands fall loose around the palm grip. That's when you'd notice the knots. He hadn't looked down once. The dropper loop at the leader junction had appeared while his eyes were on the opposite bank, fingers pulling, crossing, feeding back through, the whole operation conducted somewhere below conscious thought, like a second heartbeat. Then he'd added a loop-to-loop connector at the swivel, and that had appeared too, out of nothing, crisp and locked and perfect. Not the knots of a man who fished. The knots of a man who, 30 years ago, had tied the same hitches in complete darkness while wearing neoprene gloves and listening to the sound of surf overhead. His eyes moved. Not in the way you'd notice, not in any dramatic fashion. He wasn't craning his neck or shading his brow. They just moved, a slow, low orbit that never quite settled. The western cordgrass bank, the northern bend, the angle of the channel marker light, still blinking green, 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. He clocked it. He clocked the lean of the nearest grass stand. Tide was pushing, still an hour to slack. He clocked the shadow line under the far bank where the oyster bar began, and the bottom dropped from 8 inches to 4 feet in a distance you could step across. He knew this water the way you know a room you have slept in for decades, not the way you learned it, the way it became part of you. Then the outboard started somewhere to the north. He didn't turn his head. He just listened for 3 seconds. The pitch, the throttle cadence, the small mechanical catch in the lower unit that told him the prop was a 3-blade older running at maybe 2200 RPM on flat water. A John boat, aluminum probably, not heavy, running the main channel, not cutting inside. It passed the distance of sound in under a minute and did not grow closer. He set it down and went back to the line. His gaze moved south again, to the channel mouth. That was the place you'd watch him if you were watching, because something happened when he looked down there, not on his face, nothing that obvious, but in the quality of his stillness, which deepened in a way that had nothing to do with fishing. The cordgrass pressed back against both banks where the channel narrowed toward the keel, Pocket's southern throat. In the weak, not quite light, you could just see where the water changed color, pale gray to charcoal, the depth, differential written in the surface texture if you knew how to read it. Walter read it. His lips moved, barely. Not words, exactly. More like the ghost of a word or a name, something he was neither saying aloud nor managing to suppress entirely. He looked at that channel mouth the way a man looks at a place where something happens that cannot be made unhappen. Not grief, not loss, not exactly. Something older than both. The specific flatness that settles into a person after 30 years of keeping something, after the grief is done all it can do, and what remains is just the weight of knowing. The chart case sat on the stern thwart where it always sat. He didn't touch it. The eastern sky had gone from black to a bruised, uncertain gray. The herons would wake soon. He had maybe 20 minutes of this water and this silence and this particular quality of alone, before the marsh became the marsh again. Instead of whatever else it was to him at this hour, he let his eyes rest at the southern channel mouth a moment longer. Then he turned back to the line. Sir, I'm going to need you to acknowledge that you can hear me." Walter didn't look up. He let the line run another 2 feet off the spool, felt the weight settle into the current, and then pinched it still with 2 fingers. "I can hear you," he said. The compliance skiff came in at an angle, the way a man does when he thinks the angle itself carries authority. It was a white fiberglass hull with an orange stripe, a state seal on the bow, and a 15-horse Yamaha that Farrell cut too late, so the skiff came in fast and shallow and scraped a cordgrass bank before bumping Walter's John boat hard enough to rattle the tackle box. Walter steadied his rod. Didn't say anything about the scrape. Farrell was maybe 45, built square, and carrying a clipboard that he held chest-high the way some men carry a badge. He had on a khaki uniform shirt, cargo pants still holding their crease from yesterday's ironing, the particular look of a man who had prepared his opening remarks before leaving the dock. "Dennis Farrell, Georgia DNR Waterway Compliance," he said. "Can I get your name and your permit documentation?" "Walter Pruitt." "Mr. Pruitt, are you aware that this section of the Altamaha estuary buffer, specifically the bend locals call the Pocket, is designated a protected coastal habitat zone under State Statute 125286? Walter's eyes had gone back to the waterline, not in defiance, just back to where they lived. "I'm aware," he said. Farrell's pen clicked. "Okay. And are you currently operating under a valid non-commercial estuary use permit for this specific zone?" Pause. "My permit's in the dry bag. I'm going to need to see it, sir." Walter didn't move immediately. He watched the line for 3 more seconds. the habit of a man who does not abandon a task halfway, and then set the rod across the gunwale, the handle tucked under the cleat so it wouldn't roll. He opened the dry bag at his feet with the same unhurried economy he'd used to anchor, to row, to bait the hook, pulled out a folded paper, held it across the gap. Farrell took it, studied it, and the first flicker of disappointment crossed his face. Then he brightened again. This permit is categorized non-commercial, Zone C2. You're currently anchored in Zone C1. He turned the clipboard slightly, as though Walter might want to read it himself. Zone C1 requires a separate habitat access endorsement. That endorsement runs $40 annually. Without it, this constitutes unlicensed access to a protected estuary segment and carries a fine structure of $150 for a first occurrence. Walter looked at the clipboard, then at the waterline. "There's a grace period on that," he said. "There is not." Farrell was already writing. "I'm also noting that your anchor placement is within 30 meters of a designated cordgrass nursery boundary, which is a secondary. The anchor's in sand," Walter said, "not grass." "Sir, I am trying to explain. I know where the grass starts." Walter's voice had no edge in it, no heat. It came out the same temperature as everything else he'd said, which was somehow worse for Farrell than if he'd argued. "The boundary's 9 meters south of my stern. You can measure it." Farrell's pen hesitated, just for a second. Then he wrote something down anyway. The marsh did not care about any of this. A great blue heron lifted from the far bank without hurry, folded itself into the sky, and was gone. The cordgrass leaned in a breath of wind and straightened. The waterline ran on, copper and dark, the way it had run here since before either of these men existed. Walter reached for his rod. His eyes, already moving past Farrell's shoulder, found the southern channel mouth and held there for a half-second longer than the line required. "Sir, I need you to look at me when I'm speaking to you." Farrell's voice had changed. The official courtesy layer had thinned right through, and underneath it was something smaller. The voice of a man who was used to being the most consequential presence in any given patch of water, and was having trouble with that this morning. Walter looked at him, not at his eyes, at the clipboard, at the form half-filled, at the carbon paper beneath it starting to separate in the humidity. At Farrell's left hand, gripping the gunwale of the compliance skiff, where the aluminum had already sweated through with dew. Then Walter looked back at the water. "The form you're writing," Walter said. "That's a Class B, isn't it? Non-commercial operating violation." Farrell blinked. "That's correct, which carries a fine of $250, first offense, $500 and potential vessel impoundment on the second." Walter set the rod in the gunwale notch and let the lure sit.
"I know the penalty schedule, son."
Farrell's pen stopped. He didn't like that word, son. You could see it move through him like a small, cold current. "Then you understand," Farrell said carefully, "that continued non-compliance during an active citation proceeding is a second offense, technically." Walter nodded once. "Go ahead and write it." That wasn't the right answer. Farrell had a whole escalating structure prepared, a consequence ladder he'd climbed with dozens of irritated base fishermen and weekend kayakers, and the ladder worked because people grabbed the rungs. They argued, they explained, they bargained, they got louder. That was how the ladder worked. Walter had simply declined to touch it. Farrell wrote something, pressed too hard. The pen went through the top form. 2 miles south of the pocket, just below the cordgrass bank where the tidal creek bent hard east, 4 figures moved through water that came to their collarbones, slow, even. The cordgrass made no sound as they passed through it. The mud beneath them swallowed every step without complaint. They moved in the particular way of people who understood that speed and noise were the same problem, and that patience was a kind of armor. They were not on any schedule that Farrell knew existed. He tore the perforated form free, held it out across the 2 feet of water between the boats. "This is your notice of violation. You have 30 days to contest. I'm aware of the process, and I am advising you that if you don't move this vessel from this location within..." Farrell checked something on his clipboard. 15 minutes. I am authorized to initiate impoundment proceedings under Georgia DNR Waterway Code, section, "What channel is your radio on?" Walter asked. Farrell stopped. "Excuse me, your radio." Walter's eyes had gone back to the southern channel mouth. Back to that same spot he'd checked twice now. the place where the cordgrass grew thickest, where a shallow bend hid the eastern approach from anyone looking west. What channel are you monitoring? That is not relevant to. Switch to 16. Walter's voice hadn't changed. Still flat, still quiet. Still the voice of a man discussing weather. You may want to hear what's coming. Farrell stared at him. The marsh absorbed the silence the way it always did, without comment, without judgment. A great blue heron lifted from the eastern bank, slow and heavy and ancient-looking, its wing beats like something being folded and unfolded. It moved south without hurry and disappeared into the cordgrass. Walter watched it go. His right hand dropped to the gunwale, not to grip it, just to rest there, fingers loose, the way a man's hand rests on something familiar. The aluminum was warm already, despite the hour. The tide was rising. You could hear it if you knew what to listen for. That particular push of water against root systems, the soft percussion of the marsh breathing in. 2 miles south, 4 shapes turned north. Farrell had found his rhythm by then. The clipboard was up, pen moving, and he was into the 3rd tier, the part about adjudicated fines and appearance before the Coastal Resources Division, the part where most people started to sweat. Walter was watching the water. Not Farrell, not the form. The water just off the port bow, where the cordgrass bent in the tide push, and the surface had gone the particular color of old pewter that it goes right before the light decides what it wants to be. And I want to be clear that impoundment at this stage is discretionary, meaning I have the authority to. The water broke, not violently, not with any drama at all, which was somehow the wrong thing entirely, the wrongness of it bypassing the eyes and going straight to the spine. A shape came up through the surface, black and slick, and it did not gasp or thrash or make any sound a human being surfacing from cold. Water is supposed to make. It simply rose. Shoulders, then a rebreather rig, then a face behind a dive mask pushed up to the forehead, and the operator's eyes found Walter's boat in about 1/4 of a second, and then went to work on everything else in the vicinity with the same unhurried efficiency. Farrell stopped talking. 3 more came up, 1 off the stern, 2 on the starboard side, farther back, emerging from the cordgrass bank like it simply grown there overnight, and decided this was the moment to stand. No splashing, no signal lights. Just the sound of water running off neoprene and the soft mechanical click of something being safed. The marsh went quiet, not the normal quiet of early morning. Something different. The kind of quiet that arrives when everything with instincts decides to wait. Farrell's pen had stopped. His mouth was open, the sentence still technically in progress somewhere behind his teeth, but nothing was coming out. The clipboard was at chest height, angled slightly, the way a man holds something when his hands have received new information that his brain hasn't processed yet. The first operator, compact, deliberate, moving the way people move when movement itself is a trained discipline, reached the hull of Walter's John boat in 2 strokes and put 1 hand on the gunwale. She pulled the dive mask the rest of the way off, a woman, mid-30s, with the kind of stillness in her face that isn't calm exactly. It's the controlled aftermath of calm, the stillness you build deliberately so that nothing you're thinking shows. She looked at Walter. Her eyes moved to the chart case on the stern thwart, then back to Walter's face. "Sir," she said, low, not a greeting, more like a word used to establish bearing, the verbal equivalent of a compass check. Walter looked at her the way he'd been looking at the marsh all morning, unhurried, cataloging. The eyes that never really stopped. "Water's up a foot since 0400, he said. "You came up the middle channel." It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it. Instead, she said, "We have a grid issue, southern approach. I need to verify a landmark. Our chart's calling a cut at approximately." She named a coordinate, rattling it off in the clipped shorthand of someone who has said coordinates aloud in the dark more times than she's said her own name. Walter's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A small, precise recognition, like a key finding a lock it was made for 37 years ago and never used. "That's not the cut," he said quietly. "That's the feeder channel. Shepherd's Cut runs 40 meters southeast." The operator went completely still. Not the train still, something else. Something that happened below the training, in the part of a person that reacts before their education catches up. Her hand stayed on the gunwale. Her knuckles had gone white. Okafor didn't let go of the gunwale. She looked at him the way a person looks at a map when the terrain doesn't match what's printed. Then she raised her radio with her free hand, not to speak to anyone outside the marsh, just to speak to him. "Sir." Her voice had changed. The operational flatness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. "We have you anchored approximately 40 meters north of Grid Echo 7. That puts you just above the secondary channel split. I need to confirm our bearing on the insertion approach. We're reading the main cut as running northeast from the mouth." Walter watched his line. "You're off," he said. "That heading runs you into the south bank before the first bend. The cut angle's east-southeast. Has since the '82 storm filled the original channel." He paused. "Locals call that stretch Shepherd's Cut." The marsh went quiet. Not the wind-dying kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a sound you didn't know you were waiting for finally stops. Okafor's radio hand dropped an inch. Her eyes didn't move from his face. Behind her, one of the other operators had gone completely still in the water, fins down, not moving at all, like something that had decided to stop being a person for a moment and just listen. Shepherd's Cut didn't appear on any public chart, didn't appear on any satellite survey overlay, didn't appear on the Georgia DNR coastal navigation database that Farrell referenced approximately 6 times during his perm explanation. It appeared exactly once, in a 37-year-old coastal reconnaissance document filed under a classification level that meant most people in Naval Special Warfare Command had never seen it either. Okafor knew the name because she'd read the file. She'd read the file because she was planning this operation. She keyed the radio again. Slow, deliberate. "Sir, I need to ask, what was your last unit?" Walter finally looked at her. 2105, he said. Okafor's mouth closed. She held that for 2 full seconds. Then, almost to herself, almost like she was confirming something she had memorized from a page and never expected to say aloud in an actual marsh in actual Georgia at 4:50 in the morning, Ironwater. Walter looked back at the water. "That's the one," he said. The 4 operators didn't move, didn't speak, didn't exchange a look or a signal or any of the compressed professional shorthand you develop when you spend enough time with the same small group of people in the dark. They just held. 4 figures in the black water around a 14-foot aluminum john boat, and for a moment the whole marsh was suspended around them, cordgrass and pluff mud and the faint diesel smell from the distant channel marker, and none of it moved. It wasn't a salute. It was something older than that. It was the stillness of people who had read the file, who knew what the file meant, who understood, in the specific way that operators understand things, exactly how much the man in the fishing shirt had done in this waterway before any of them were trained, before most of them were old enough to enlist, and who had never told anyone. Over in the compliance skiff, Dennis Farrell had stopped writing. He hadn't moved in a while, actually. The citation form was still on the clipboard. His pen was still uncapped, but his hand had come down from the writing position and was just resting there, holding the board. The way a man holds something he no longer knows the purpose of. The cordgrass moved in a small gust off the estuary, and the blank bottom portion of the citation form fluttered against the clip. Farrell watched the operators in the water. He watched the old man in the boat. He didn't say anything. Whatever he'd been certain of 40 minutes ago had drained out of him quietly, the way the tide drains out of the marsh. Not all at once, just gone when you look up and notice it's not there anymore. Okafor pulled herself half out of the water onto the aluminum gunwale, one hand gripping the bow cleat. She wasn't asking permission. She was using the boat as a platform the way operators use anything available, efficiently, without ceremony. Her other hand held a laminated chart, current issue, and she spread it flat against the hull with her palm. "We've got a problem," she said. Not to Walter specifically, to the situation. One of the operators behind her, the one who hadn't moved since surfacing, just holding position in the shallows with the water at his collar, turned his head slightly, waiting. Okafor tapped the chart. "Insertion route runs through the mid-channel approach here. Satellite pass from 72 hours ago shows clear bottom, but we hit a bar 40 meters short of the split. Full combat load. We're not getting through on this tide." Walter looked at the spot she was tapping. He didn't say anything for 3 seconds, maybe 4. His eyes tracked the chart the way they'd tracked the waterline all morning, not hurriedly, just reading. Then he looked up at the southern channel mouth. The same place he'd looked before, that long beat that had seemed like nothing, like an old man daydreaming. That bar shifts, he said, always has. It anchors on the north end at a submerged oak snag from the 47 blow, moves 6 to 8 meters east every flood season. Your satellite caught it mid-drift. Okafor's hand had stopped moving on the chart. Walter reached for the waterproof chart case on the stern thwart. His fingers found the buckle without looking at it. He undid it slowly, not dramatically, the way you open something you've opened 10,000 times and haven't opened in 37 years. The case was cracked at the spine, the canvas stiff with old salt. What came out was a single folded sheet, not printed, not laminated, hand-drawn on waterproof survey paper, the lines laid in pencil and then gone over in ink, depth soundings marked in columns of careful handwriting, contour lines tight where the channel narrowed and wide where it spread into the pocket's main basin. He spread it across the bow, flat, both palms pressing the edges. Okafor looked at it for one full second before she understood what she was looking at. Then she went very still. "Shepherd's Cut," Walter said, pointing to a hand labeled bend. "Bar ends here, right where this notation is. 43 meters of navigable window at flood -2 hours. Bottom's packed clay, not sand, won't shift under a combat load. Depth runs 8 feet through the center. 4.5 at the edges, stays that way up to here." His finger moved an inch north on the paper, then it shoals fast. He tapped the margin number beside the notation. "Tide this morning runs about 12 minutes late on this reach, always has. Something to do with the spoil islands east of the main channel backing the flood." Okafor looked at the depth marking, then at her chart, then back. "That's not on anything we have," she said. "No," Walter said, "it wouldn't be." She looked at the notation again, her jaw moved slightly, like she was doing math or translating something. "This is exact," she said. "I was thorough," Walter said. He said it without pride. Just the same flat tone he'd used all morning for everything. The same voice that had said the redfish run best before the heron's wake, and told Farrell what tier of citation didn't apply to him, and given 4 digits to a SEAL lieutenant commander who'd only ever seen his call sign in a classified file. Behind Okafor, the 3 operators in the water had moved in without sound. They were all looking at the chart on the bow now. None of them spoke. The marsh ticked quietly around them, cordgrass and tide, and the small distant diesel of a vessel that had nothing to do with any of this. Farrell hadn't moved, his clipboard was still in his hand. Okafor was still looking at the survey. Her finger hadn't moved from the window Walter had marked, but her eyes had drifted up to the margin, to the corner of Shepherd's Cut. 2 letters, penciled in, small and careful, the way you'd write something you didn't want to forget but couldn't say out loud. RT. She didn't point at them. She just looked at Walter and asked quiet enough that only he could hear. "Whose initials are those?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the water off the port side. The tide had turned while they'd been talking. He could tell by the way the cordgrass leaned, by a small line of foam catching against the hull. A minute passed, maybe more. "Petty Officer 2nd Class Raymond Tran," he said, "combat diver, best man in the water I ever worked with." He paused. "We were 3 days into the survey when they pulled the op forward. Tide window closed faster than the models predicted. Ray went in to check the depth at Shepherd's Cut personally because the sounding line had fouled and we needed the number." He stopped. Okafor waited. He didn't come back up. Walter's voice hadn't changed in pitch or volume. It had just gone somewhere further away. "Current under that cut runs different than the surface reads. I know that now because I finished the survey anyway. 3 more days. Every sounding. Every depth. I measured the exact bottom feature that took him and I wrote it down so no one else would ever go in there blind." One of the operators at the bow had his eyes down. Another had turned slightly toward open water. "I put his initials at the corner because the survey was supposed to be classified and never cited," Walter said. "So he wasn't ever going to get credit either. I figured if I had to be anonymous, he could be anonymous right next to me." He looked at the 2 letters in the margin. Something in his jaw moved. His family got a letter that said training accident. That was all they got. Okafor's hand had come to rest flat on the chart, not covering the initials, just near them, the way you set your hand near something fragile. "There was going to be a commendation," she said. For the survey. If it had been filed properly, if you'd put your name on it. I know. Why didn't you? Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the channel mouth to the south. The place Shepherd's Cut opened into the broader estuary, unmarkable on any satellite image, just another bend in the grass. The marsh didn't need my name on it, he said. It just needed someone to know it. Okafor didn't respond. There wasn't anything to respond to. That sentence had landed in the air between them, and it was staying there. She lifted the chart gently and passed it back to Walter. He took it with both hands, the same way he'd taken the oars that morning in the dark, without hurrying. He started to fold it. Leave it, Okafor said, quietly. Not an order, more like a request from someone who understood what they were looking at. Walter stopped. He looked at the chart spread open on the bow. 37 years of depth soundings in his own handwriting, the names he'd given to channels that had no names, the one window through Shepherd's Cut that he'd bought with a week of grief and measured to the meter. All of it hand-drawn, pencil lines on waterproof paper, the kind of document that was never supposed to exist and therefore never did. The chart lay open. The two letters sat in the margin. The marsh moved around them, cordgrass and tide and the soft percussion of water against the aluminum hull, and for the first time in 37 years, Walter Pruitt was not the only person in the world who knew Raymond Tran had been there. Okafor gave one small nod before she went under. No words, nothing that needed them. The other three followed, 4 ripples. Then the marsh took them back. Farrell's skiff had already rounded the bend. Walter never watched it go. He pulled the anchor, coiled the line, fit the oars into the locks the way he always did. The same grip, the same angle, the slight forward lean before the pull. The cordgrass caught the first gray light along its edges and held it there, thin and pale, not quite morning yet. He rowed. The pocket fell away behind him. The channel opened, pluff mud and tide, and somewhere distant a great blue heron lifted off a sandbar without a sound, just the shadow of it crossing the water. The chart case sat on the stern thwart where it always sat. The clasp was open. He hadn't latched it. He didn't reach back to 200 yards. The motor, the slow idle home through channels only he could name, past the place where the bar ends and the deep water begins, past Shepherd's Cut, past a week in 1987 that belonged to 2 men and became the quiet work of one. The marsh didn't need his name on it. It just needed someone to know it.